All right, let's go ahead and get started. This is the Crying Out Cloud panel, and it's going to be moderated by Wiz's own Raaz.
Thank you. Okay, I'm happy we have like 5 people on the stage to follow Corey. It seems like the only good way of following up Corey's talk. So I'm Raaz. I'm CMO and VP Product Strategy at Wiz, and I'll be leading today's panel. Maybe we'll start by each of you introducing yourself. Ami, you can go first, and we'll go that way.
Hi, I'm Ami, CTO, co-founder of Wiz. Great to be here.
Hey everyone, I'm Tyler. I'm a director of vulnerability management at Salesforce.
Chris Hughes, president, co-founder at Aquia, and also a cyber innovation fellow at CISA.
I'm Dan Lorenc, co-founder and CEO of Chainguard, and I just won this awesome wizard hat.
Woo!
So I'll just like the rules of engagement, I'll throw questions, but everybody can talk whenever, really. It's all questions about kind of cloud security and how you see it today. And I'll start with Chris. On like, where do you see state of cloud security in the next 5 years? A light one to open.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking of this when Alam was giving the opening talk and talking about all the APTs and stuff. And I think some of the major changes we'll see is like the evolution of the shared responsibility model. We even see some of the large IaaS providers, Google calling it shared fate, talking about the interdependency of the entire ecosystem on the hyperscale IaaS providers, for example, and just more of a push to secure by design, secure by default, and more onus and responsibility on the IaaS provider, given how many people rely and build on top of them, and that most organizations are not going to be well equipped to kind of compete against these APTs. And also, I think we'll see an evolution away from, we're trying to build guardrails and paved paths and things like that, but also more resiliency. We're talking about CDR, for example, later on in the conversation, detection and response, and resiliency, I think will be some key themes we see as well.
Thank you. Anybody else wants to add in? Okay. Well, I'll continue again with you. Sorry, no, wrong one. So moving to Tyler. When we think about this, like what kind of KPIs or metrics do you actually use to measure your organization's success of their cloud security program?
Yeah, so there's 3 kind of buckets or themes of KPIs that we really look at to see like how mature our cloud security posture is. I think the first one is really our tool effectiveness or efficacy. So that's going to be things like mean time to detect. And I think one big one, especially at Salesforce, that we really look at is our false positive rate. At Salesforce, we're a very big company. We have over 10,000 developers. So if we send out a bad detection to these developers and they spend an hour, 2 hours across those 10,000 developers, that's millions and millions of dollars of their time that could be spent on, I don't know, building Gen AI features because we all love Gen AI. So that's like the first bucket. The next bucket is really the risk or remediation metrics. The typical ones you see, SLAs, how many criticals do you have, things like that. But I think one thing that we're really kind of changing and looking at a bit more is doing it more on a business unit by business unit perspective, so by product. So one product's posture or attack surface might be different than another's. We shouldn't just say, okay, you all need to have a 99% SLA, fix all your criticals, because one critical might not be the same across them. So really doing more business unit specific metrics. And I think the last one, which Chris kind of just mentioned, was paved path, but more adoption metrics on that. So how many people are adopting our managed images, or in Dan's case, because of Chainguard, I know near and dear to his heart, how many of these images do we have rolled out? How many are just using the default ones where they have to go and fix? Basically making security easy for the developers. If we can give them a secure by default template, and they don't have to really think of anything. They just say, build pipeline, use this, deploy, we're done. Rather than it's already deployed, they have to go back, they have to configure it themselves. They might not know how, as Corey was kind of talking about when it comes to identities. So that's one of the big ones that we really look at.
If I can follow up to that, like I think you mentioned how you partner with your development team. How is security kind of viewed internally inside the organization? Like those are almost like ideal processes, and that's often the challenge. Like how does it look like?
Yeah, I would be saying that I'm talking from my ivory tower, but that's definitely not the way that it is. Kind of in the past, and it's been changing a bit recently, is we were looked at as a blocker and not an enabler. So it was security is kind of the stick approach. I always have to go through security. I have to wait 3 weeks for them to review my system design before I can actually go build. And we're really trying to change that from supervisory to advisory. So really making it easy for them to do security right. And then we'll kind of come in, they can come to us if they need to. They have questions like, oh, this is really confusing my architecture. I don't know if I'm doing something wrong. Can you advise me? So we're trying to do that, make it security easy so they do the right thing by default. And then if they might not be able to do that, then we can kind of come in and help them.
Where I can add that, like, if you think about what you just said, I think security has a brand problem, right? It's like it's not just, you know, even the internet, right? It's like it's considered boring and, you know, it's like, as Corey said, like stuff that you just, it's just in the to-do list, right? And like one of the challenges, I think, if you think about like making security easy, fun, right? With the metrics, you can do maybe gamification and accurate. Right? Because if it's not accurate, you have no trust and no one will ever listen to you, right? But if you can rebrand security, and honestly also, I mean, a lot of the effort what we try to do also, I'm looking even internally in ways, is really trying to look at security in a different way, right? It should be important, easy, fun, and accurate, and then everyone will do it, right? Ideally. And I think that's a challenge for everyone. Like, as vendors, as security teams, how do we change the approach, right, to security to be something that, yeah, I want to do it. I understand the importance. It's, you know, it's actually pretty easy, fun, and you know, I like doing it. So obviously that's a bit futuristic. But if we can make it a bit more like that, I think it drives huge efficiency and improvements.
Yeah, I was going to say, just to add on to his point too, is like, you know, being that enabler, historically, like we've seen this push for DevSecOps and things like that, but all we've done is push a lot of low fidelity, noisy tools towards developers, and they dread engaging with us. They view us as, like he said, the stick or the office of no. And we've, instead of breaking down silos, we've actually bolstered them. And they're going to find a way around that, and you're going to end up playing catch up later, you know, bolting on security. So being that enabler is critical.
I had a question, Tyler. You mentioned ivory tower stuff. Are your security teams embedded at all within the development teams, or are they all kind of segregated out? Or have you experimented with those models?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's kind of a hybrid approach. We definitely have a lot more when you kind of think about the enterprise, so controls that go across all the business units. We have that, you know, outside of the business units. But then we start to kind of talk about product security, where you need to have like a deep understanding of the product itself to be able to do that job well. Then it's a little bit more embedded. But kind of, as Chris was mentioning, there are still going to be silos. There's still those issues, and we're trying to improve on that and do some things around that.
Okay, I'll start with you then. Now, how do you see like the future of this, like the future of cloud security evolving, and how should organizations prepare today?
Sure, I think the biggest change, the biggest acceleration we're all seeing, I mean, it was shown in the first talk with the most commonly attacked technologies. It's open source mostly, right? Open source is growing faster and faster. There's more open source everywhere. Developers can deploy it without having to go through procurement. It's everywhere, and the vulnerabilities being exploited are the older ones in open source. Kind of at this transition point now where organizations are grappling with the massive amount of inventory they pulled in recently in the last few years with open source, and now trying to get update strategies in place for that and being able to keep up with the pace that open source is moving to avoid being hit with a 3-year-old 0-day that's running an infrastructure that they didn't even know existed.
If I could add to that is, you know, the open source is pervasive, as he talked about. And it's funny that, you know, here after all these years of having SANs or CIS, critical security controls around asset inventory, we're just now starting to take like stock of the open source that we use. And I think it's going to continue to evolve, look beyond like lagging indicators of risk, like known vulnerabilities, and looking at the sustainment of a project, how many people are maintaining it. How responsive they are. And also the organization themselves understanding that like open source software maintainers are not their suppliers. They don't owe you anything. You have no SLA with them. You can make no demands of them in most cases. You have to be responsible for the open source you're consuming and deciding to use in your products.
And I think that correlates well with my next question, which also kind of goes directly to Alon's talk in the beginning. What are like the common security threats you think organizations face today? And I'll turn it to Ami because his team does such an incredible job of tracking all of them and also categorizing them so we know what's actually risking organizations. So
when we look at threats in the cloud, I think, and again, Alon's talk was, I think, very revealing, is that eventually, almost, you can break down almost all of the attacks to a few known patterns of attack. And you keep saying, wait, if it's known, why don't we just stop it, right? But the point is that it's easy to understand, okay, if there is a known vulnerability in a known technology, it shouldn't be exposed to the internet, right? I mean, it sounds simple enough, but it's not, because everything is moving very fast. You don't always know what's happening. The tools are not fast enough, not seamless enough. They have coverage gaps. So really, the problem is that although we understand the mechanics of how usually attacks actually happen, right? We are still fail many times to actually stop them, right? Sometimes we know about the risk and just no one did anything to actually block it. And sometimes we, like, maybe someone in security knows about it, but the actual engineer didn't think about it's actually important because it's in the endless to-do list, right? So I think the core is always the same. We do understand how the majority of attacks actually unfold. We have enough intelligence, right? The gap is that security is against the human nature, right? It really goes back to that. The human nature is to say, okay, I'll do it later. And you have to understand, no, it's if you do it later, it might be too late.
So I'll follow up on that, and also kind of knowing that you, in a lot of ways, ran security internally in Wiz for the longest time until we hired like a full security team.
Real security person.
Exactly, a real security team. Like, how do you address that with limited resources? Because that's what organizations really have.
So honestly, the only way to ensure security is done is to infuse the responsibility into the people that actually are building the systems, right? And that's exactly what Tyler was saying. That's honestly like the only way to do it, especially in cloud where the engineers move so fast that if you look to the right, look to the left, it's a different environment. The day you go to RSA, you go back, it's a different environment, right? So it's there is a problem here. The problem is speed, right? And the only way is they understand, hey, yes, I'm security, I'm responsible, but it's shared, right? You're responsible, okay? Like you have to own it. You have to own it. You have to come to me if you have questions. And I think in Wiz we do have a really good culture because all developers are actually coming from security background, and that we are very security minded, obviously, because we're a security company. That actually helps us to understand all of the executives are very security focused. It's not always the case in all of companies that where the security team feels a bit outsider, right? We're not doing security because of compliance. We actually understand the risk, right? But if it doesn't come from the top, it's impossible, right? Like it's branding and education. That's really security is #1 priority is branding and education. It's actually marketing. So you should be leading security. But honestly, in a big company, it's really about that.
Can I add to that real quick? I love what he said there about being marketing, because really we talk so much about technical skills, but it comes down to storytelling, building trust, building empathy, building rapport with your development engineering peers that can have a real outcome on security, and then also empowering the people building the system to actually secure the system because they have the context. Often security is separated, like he talked about in some cases, and it ends up being a long situation of developers and engineers trying to explain how something works or why it was designed a certain way and so on, instead of just empowering them to be the ones to actually secure it to begin with.
Yeah, I always hate saying this when you mentioned it's a shared ownership. When ownership is shared, it means no one owns it, but it's really the only way to make security work in this environment. Everyone has to own it. Everyone has to be responsible for the pieces they're in charge of. Security teams back in the old day when they said no to everything, like we were talking about, the no stick everywhere. The best red team is a developer just trying to get their job done. They will find a way around any security process or protocol you can come up with just to get their job done. And when that happens, the partnership breaks down, you lose control of the inventory management, and you don't know how developers are working. So that partnership and that shared ownership is critical.
I have to say I love this hat for talks because no, you can't see, but there's like a part of it at the top that's almost like nodding when you talk. It's like reinforcement in like a good way. We should always use a hat note. So okay, one actually area where I feel like you talked about marketing and branding, like there's also a constantly evolving world of terms, and I want to transition this a bit to talk about like CDR, which is cloud detection and response. I can say that when we look at that arena, it's like this new term, but really it's the core question of, okay, cloud transformed the way we think about infrastructure security. That's our whole like premises for existence here at Wiz. And I think when we look at what detection teams use, SOC teams use, how detection is done in cloud today, it's something that organizations are now starting to feel similar gaps, right? Like where you have a SOC team that gets like an alert on a host that runs containers, and for them it's a VM, but the whole thing is so different right now. So we want to move the discussion a bit to that area, and I'll move it to the hat and Dan. Like, how do you think about your strategy for detection and response in cloud?
Yeah, so we're a much smaller company than say Salesforce, and most other companies out there. Our security organization is embedded within our engineering organization. Our CTO, just like you, is responsible for all of our security now until we were large enough to go build a real security organization. We also have strangely different infrastructure than a lot of companies because we're focused on supply chain, so a lot of ours is really CI, CD infrastructure, and we've had to build a lot of this ourselves because most tools don't really look at that part of the stack. But it looks the same kind of at a high level. It's heavily based on IAM, audit log, or access log auditing, all tooling around making sure that the right systems are talking to the right systems, alerts that go right to the engineers if something is accessed that it shouldn't be, and trying to get that as close to the engineering team that's responsible for it as they can so they have the most context.
So if it's okay to follow up, like what products do you use? Like do you have, like are you planning on going a traditional SIEM type of way? Like what products do you use?
Yeah, we rolled out a traditional SIEM a little while ago. We had to customize it a lot to look at the systems and the agents and the endpoints that we're using because, again, it's more like GitHub Action style runners, and that's where most of our sensitive data and critical infrastructure is. So we do have to customize a lot of it. We build a lot of it ourselves. We try not to, just because there aren't really that many tools in this area that we're the most worried about. And we try to minimize our cloud footprint wherever we can. We try to just do the least possible to minimize risk at a high level.
Minimize cloud?
Yeah, if not minimize cloud, just minimize everything, which means minimizing cloud. Yeah.
We still allow him here.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, actually, like, I'd love for you to answer it the same way. Like, what do we use internally, and how do you think about like detection for cloud?
First of all, we use cloud a lot. Cloud is secure. So I think the way we see, we see this as a key part of our role in the world, is like trying to think about how we've done things before cloud, understanding just it doesn't work for cloud, and then try to see, okay, how it should be done for cloud. And I think for threat detection, it's the same, right? If you try to take the same tools that you've been using until today and try to use them for cloud, it just doesn't work, right? So if you try to take, again, especially in a large environment, like a huge cloud environment, if you try to take all of the logs, all of the network logs, everything, pump into the SIEM, right? It's just not going to work, right? So the pitfalls are always to try to use the legacy tools and approaches and try to use them to solve the cloud problems, right? It's just not, it's going to be impossible to send all of the logs to a SIEM. It's going to be hugely expensive. And it's also like a lot of waste of time because you try to create detections where the team doesn't actually know what the developers are actually building. It's not going to work. As you said, like the only way to make it work is that you have to bring it close to developers, right? So you have to change the architecture. You have to rethink how to do threat detection. I think for us, it's definitely one of the challenges now working with customers. Okay, what should be the architecture for detection in cloud? Assuming that we want to build something completely new, how it should be done? How can we bring the detections to be much more automated, much faster, much more easily consumable and closer to engineers? And for us, that's exactly the challenges we're trying to solve now with the customers.
And also, like in some ways, our scale is cute, but then it comes to a company like Salesforce. I'd be curious, like Tyler, how do you think of it? And also maybe with a focus on like incident recovery, response. How are you thinking about this in cloud?
Yeah, I think at a high level, incident response is still the same fundamentally. You still have your preparation, your detections, the response to those detections, containing, eradication. But when we talk about the cloud, it really is the scale becomes very difficult. And I know just from an alerting perspective, because I see some of the alerts that our CSIRT team gets, and I don't even understand how they can even acknowledge all of them. And that becomes difficult because then you get alert fatigue. You're not going to be able to see, kind of like Chris was mentioning a bit earlier, low fidelity alerts. You're going to ignore the ones that might be your red team or a threat actor because you're just like, oh, there's another false positive developer doing something they shouldn't. So I think one of the things is really making sure that you don't just fire out alerts to fire out alerts. You find those really high fidelity ones. And I know we have a amazing threat detection team. They like to, not Gen AI, they like to put machine learning on top of it. And they really try to see, okay, this is known behavior. We've seen this all the time. No big deal. Hey, developer, just make sure like this is like the case. And then it's like, this seems a bit anomalous. We really should go spend resources to go look into this. So really tuning down the alerts, looking at the highest ones, and really focusing on that just because in cloud scale, it's impossible to do what you might have done on-prem. And I think the other side of it too, where it becomes a bit more difficult, is complexity. I mean, as Corey was talking about, and as we know in the cloud, it's less of a perimeter, which is kind of the typical style. Okay, let's go really monitor our perimeter. If there's alerts there, we're going to really deep dive into those because there's probably something wrong. Where it's now mostly identity-based, and cloud identities are very complex, and there's a lot of them. And when you talk about deployments with like Terraform, CloudFormation, you can sprawl out a bad IAM role across, in our case, tens of thousands of accounts, and next thing you know, all you need is access to that one role, and you have access to everything. So it's a different skill set, and really more of an emphasis. You're going away from like forensics on a given device. Now we're going to go look at audit logs, as Chris was mentioning, and looking at what are these things doing? Is that normal? If not, okay, let's go spend our time to go investigate those.
Makes sense. Also, like a good follow-up to that is like, I'll turn it over to Chris. Like, what type of like emerging challenges do you see specifically around this area of detection and response in cloud organizations face?
Yeah, I mean, he actually touched on it quite well, and I work with like large federal environments, large enterprises, and complicated environments like that in the hybrid cloud, and it's just the amount of noise and trying to drive signal to the noise. It's the same conversation we have around vulnerability management. There's just simply a lot of noise, and the cloud has, like he said, accelerated that. You know, now there's APIs and automation, and things can be, you know, problems can be scaled just as fast as solutions. And trying to make sense of all that, and the legacy SOC SIEM, you know, type tooling just hasn't really facilitated that transition quite well to cloud. Like you were talking about, where we're moving towards cloud detection and response, of leveraging the same things that can cause problems, like APIs and automation, to kind of have higher fidelity findings, make more sense of the noise that we're seeing. And we have workforce constraints too, right? There's cognitive overload for engineers and security engineers and so on, incident response analysts and things like that. And it's trying to get them empowered with the right information at the right time to make the right decision without just bombarding them, as he said, you know, with endless amounts of alerts, notifications, logs, and pings, among all the other things they're doing throughout the day.
And I think like one other area is around automation and automating what we can. In that way, I think like Chainguard is a super cool company. We're like taking new elements of how we build in cloud and saying, okay, like we can use automation a lot more and in different ways than we thought of. So Daniel, I'm curious, like, where does automation fit and how you see this area?
Yeah, I think our unique take to automation probably is that it doesn't need to be perfect for it to still be useful. A lot of problems are hard, and you can't perfectly automate things, and you can't remediate every vulnerability, and you can't patch everything. But if you can do 90% of it automatically and then cut that noise down by a factor of 10, where you can't automate things, that's fine, and that's still a huge win. My past job before this was Google, and you know, they're kind of the opposite end, and if something wasn't perfectly solvable at massive scale with automation, then they wouldn't even consider it. All the edge cases and everything like that get in the way and make programming hard. Those are still, people can solve those, and that's what people are really good at, and taking the simple stuff off of their plate with basic automation can give them more time to focus on the hard and complex edge cases, and then you can keep iterating that and getting better and better at automation over time. But starting simple with everything is always the best approach.
True to life. And we are almost like, I think, at time, but one question I knew is I wanted to turn to Ami for. Ami always finds like the gap in everything, like the challenge in everything. So what do you think are like the biggest gaps or the biggest pitfalls for organizations? Like, what should organizations keep in mind when they think of cloud security? You mentioned like thinking about it like on-prem and using on-prem tools. What are the other places where you see organizations kind of fall that are common?
So if I have to, you know, break it down to one word, I think cloud is about speed, right? It's about speed. Like Alon mentioned, we talk about AI. There's a lot of buzz in AI, but it's not just buzz. I mean, we saw in our data 70% of the cloud environments already have AI, right? It wasn't like that a year ago. So speed, right? So I think the gap. I think all security teams, they sort of feel they have a FOMO. You know, they constantly fear they're missing out on stuff that are happening, and they should know about it, but they just don't, right? Because there's so many teams now using AI, they didn't tell them about it. So, and maybe they should be knowing. Maybe it's important, right? So, like this FOMO feeling, where am I included in everything I'm supposed to know? Again, I don't want to be a blocker. I just want to help you, right? But do I know? Because I do need to know, because maybe an attacker will use it before me. So there is a FOMO of basically, did someone expose a database and I don't know about it, right? So like this feeling of cloud is moving fast. How am I going to be in front of this, right? That's a gap and that's why, again, all of the tools, all of the processes, all of the culture in the company needs to serve one purpose, right? Staying in front of it and not just being behind of it. If you're behind, attacker can be in front of it, right? So this is the challenge. It's moving very fast. We want to enable it, right? But we need to keep it moving very fast, and at least in the speed of cloud. And that's something that is in the core of the challenge for security teams, and that's the gap for many companies. Like, that's the question you should ask yourself. Like, am I moving in the speed of cloud in my company? And if you're not, then, okay, how can I make this more efficient? And again, the answer has to be democratization, self-service, all of those concepts we talked about, because otherwise there's just no chance you're going to move as fast as the cloud.
Any additional thoughts before we close?
Yeah, I use an analogy in my head, like the whole shift left thing. You know, years ago, developers just wrote code. If you needed a machine, you filed a ticket. Some platform team would provision a server for you. Security would get a chance to review it. They didn't miss out on this stuff. And when shift left happened, now developers can do anything they want. They can provision resources that are live 2 seconds later. And security kind of missed out on that, and they were stuck over on the right-hand side. And now it's a chance for security to run left too and embrace those same principles, but it's a completely different operating model.
Yeah, I think if I was going to use one word like on me, I think education, kind of going to Dan's point, developers are the best red team because they're going to find the path of least resistance to get what they need done, because they always have some feature freeze, some release that they need to do immediately. And so they're going to do whatever's easiest, which might be spinning up that S3 bucket with public everything, because they're going to be able to access it from wherever they need to go. So I think education, especially when we talk about the shifting left, do it in the pipeline or when they're writing code. Like, hey, developer, you probably shouldn't be doing this. They're like, oh, shoot, you're right. Oh, here's a template for you that's going to make it easier. Go apply. Boom, they're done. And they might not have known that, or maybe they did know, but like, I'm not going to spend the time. I just want this to get out quick. So making it very easy to them through automation, through education, I think is important.
I'll just add, from my perspective, I like the aspect of speed. If you read the latest Verizon DBIR, it talks about exploitation accelerating past remediation by 20 days or so, and that's backed by other institutes like Scientia and who do research around vulnerabilities and misconfigurations. And then I love the approach of Chainguard, which is actually minimizing the technical debt, the security technical debt from the onset. That way you have less things to worry about to begin with. And then I like what he said about being easy to use for developers and engineers, because I think of developers and engineers like water. They're going to find the crack, right? They're going to get through some way. So if you can make that way through you're going to have visibility, you're going to have transparency, you're going to have trust, and that can lead to more secure outcomes.
Thank you so much, everybody. This is super interesting for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.